Right now, more than 300,000 people across Europe have packed a bag, grabbed their kids or their pets, and left their homes behind. Not because of a war, not because a bomb went off, because of fire. Spain has just declared a national emergency for the area around its own capital city. Madrid, not a small town, not a forest, nobody visits, the capital of one of the biggest countries in Europe. And the man in charge of stopping the fire looked at cameras this week and said something officials almost never say out loud. He said the fire is beyond the ability of firefighters to control. Let that sit for a second. That is not a weather forecaster guessing about tomorrow. That is the person whose entire job is putting out fires, telling the public, on the record, that his teams cannot stop what is burning. People do not say that unless it is completely true and completely necessary to admit. At the same time, in France, something even stranger is happening. Officials there are calling this one of the biggest peacetime evacuations the country has ever run. Peacetime. They had to say that word on purpose because the last time this many French people were moved out of their homes this fast, it was during a war. And in Italy, firefighters are being killed while trying to protect towns from flames. Water is running so low in the north that one of Italy's biggest rivers just hit its lowest level ever recorded. And a heat wave is squeezing the whole country from 2 different directions at once. One island alone has already logged more than 1,000 separate fire emergencies in just a couple of weeks, which is not something you normally hear about a single stretch of coastline, no matter how hot the summer gets. 3 different countries, 3 different governments, all admitting, in their own words, that this is bigger than anything their normal systems were built to handle. Here's the part almost nobody is talking about yet. One of these fires did not just burn houses and forests, it reached something that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction movie, a set of giant satellite dishes that scientists use to talk to spacecraft flying past other planets. We are going to get to exactly how that happened later, and it is one of the wildest details in this entire story. So how did 3 separate countries end up fighting fires this big at the same time, with officials openly admitting they might lose control of some of them? That is exactly what we are going to break down piece by piece. So by the end of this video, you will understand this crisis better than almost anyone reading the headlines about it. Before we go further, if you are the kind of person who wants to actually understand big world events instead of just scrolling past scary headlines, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down disasters like this one calmly and clearly, without the panic and without the guessing, so you always know what is actually true and what is just noise. That is a real reason to stick around, not just a request. Now let's start where this crisis is hitting hardest right now. Spain. Section 2. Madrid sends in the army. To understand how serious this is, you need to understand one decision Spain made this week that almost never happens. When a wildfire gets bad enough, Spain does not just send more firefighters. It can call in something called the UME, which stands for Military Emergency Unit. This is not a group that shows up for a normal summer fire. It exists for the kind of disaster where regular fire crews are simply overwhelmed, and the country needs one command center running the whole operation, coordinating everything from the ground up, without different city and regional teams stepping on each other or working from different playbooks. Spain called in the UME this week. That alone tells you how bad things had gotten. In Spain's own emergency system, wildfires get ranked by how serious they are, and there is a top tier reserved only for fires the national government officially declares to be of national interest. That top tier hands control away from the local region and gives it straight to the national government. That is exactly what happened here. And it is a little like a hospital moving a patient out of a regular room and straight into intensive care. It is not a step anyone takes unless the situation truly demands it. Here is where the fire actually started. A little west of Madrid, near a small town called San Martín de Valdeglesias, several separate fires broke out close together. Fire does not always stay small and contained. Under the right conditions, it spreads outward in every direction it can, and if 2 fires are close enough, they can grow until they touch and become one much bigger fire. That is exactly what happened here. Fires that started near the towns of Villa del Prado, Almarox, and San Martín de Valdeglesias grew and grew until they merged into a single wildfire, one that firefighters now track under an official name, because it has become such a major event on its own. The numbers here are hard to picture, so let's break them down simply. This fire has already burned through more than 27,000 hectares. A hectare is roughly the size of a soccer field. So imagine more than 27,000 soccer fields side by side, all turned to ash, stretching further than you could walk in a single day. And this fire was still active and still spreading when officials made their most serious statement yet. The commander running the operation said something very specific. He said the 2 original fires were touching each other along a stretch of land about 14 to 15 kilometers long. That is roughly the distance of a long, hard bike ride, except instead of a road, it is a wall of active flame. Once fires connect like that over that much distance, Stopping them stops being a matter of just adding more firefighters. The fire has enough fuel and enough front line that it can keep finding new directions to spread in, especially when the wind shifts without warning, which is exactly what has been happening this week. Spain has thrown a huge amount of resources at this, more than 2,700 personnel, more than 400 ground vehicles, 21 aircraft dropping water and fire retardant from above. On top of that, extra help has come in from neighboring European countries under an emergency assistance program, because Spain's own resources alone were not going to be enough to fight a fire this size, while also watching for new ones breaking out elsewhere in the country. Tens of thousands of people living in the towns near this fire have had to evacuate or shelter in place with their doors and windows shut. Some towns have had to be evacuated more than once, as the fire direction kept changing, forcing families to leave, come back, and then leave again within the same week. The president of the Madrid region called this situation totally unprecedented, a phrase officials do not use casually. She said it created fear of things getting even worse in the hours that followed. And she asked residents for patience while every available resource kept working around the clock, day and night, without stopping. At one press conference held right in the middle of the fire zone, she announced that 2 more towns had just been added to the evacuation list, meaning families who thought they were watching the fire from a safe distance suddenly found out they needed to pack up and leave too, sometimes with only a few hours of warning before the flames arrived close enough to matter. One resident from a town near the fire line described walking through the area a few days after flames had already passed through it. Smaller fires were still glowing in the upper branches of pine trees, and coals were still burning at the base of others. The smoke hung so thick over the town that walking through the surrounding woods without covering your face was genuinely painful. That is what a fire this size leaves behind even after the worst of it has passed. It does not simply switch off. It smolders, it lingers, and it keeps threatening to flare back up for days afterward. Spain's interior minister described one overnight stretch in blunt terms, saying the night ahead was not going to be easy and that weather conditions had not helped at all. When the person running the country's entire emergency response describes a single night that plainly, you know the situation on the ground is genuinely dangerous, not just inconvenient. Now here's something that makes this fire different from almost any other wildfire story you have heard. This is not happening out in some remote, empty wilderness far from anyone. This fire is close enough to Madrid that smoke from it has drifted right into the capital, thick enough that people walking outside in the city could feel it in their throat and see it hanging in the air over the skyline. A wildfire usually feels like something that happens far away from big cities, on the news, somewhere else. This one is close enough to touch daily life in one of the largest capital cities in Europe, changing how millions of people breathe the air outside their own front doors. But there's a second major Spanish fire that deserves just as much attention because on its own it might be the biggest story of the summer if it were not happening at the same time as everything else. Northeast of Madrid, near a town in Guadalajara province, a separate wildfire broke out inside a natural park area in a mountain landscape home to eagles, wolves, and other wildlife that had never faced anything like this before. This fire eventually burned through more than 32,000 hectares, making it one of the largest single wildfires Spain has recorded in this century, second only to a fire from the previous year that burned even more land further north. Officials had to coordinate a huge evacuation effort across more than 30 villages in the area, moving people out of the path of a fire that was, at its peak, completely uncontrollable using ground crews alone, forcing teams to rely heavily on aircraft instead because it was simply too dangerous to send people in on foot. At its worst, this fire pushed toward a mountain peak in the area that stands close to 1,900 meters high, forcing crews to fight flames on terrain steep enough that walking it safely takes real skill, even without a fire chasing you up the slope. Experts who track the cost of these disasters estimate that fighting and cleaning up after a fire like this can run into tens of thousands of euros for every single hectare burned, which, on a fire this size, adds up to tens of millions of euros before the recovery even really begins. Firefighters eventually managed to stabilize this fire and bring it under control, which was genuinely good news in the middle of an otherwise brutal week. But 32,000 hectares of forest does not grow back overnight. Forest like this can take decades to fully recover, sometimes even longer, depending on the type of trees and the condition of the soil underneath them, once the fire passes through. The families who evacuated from those villages are going to return home to a landscape that looks completely different than the one they left. And it is going to stay that way for a very long time, possibly for the rest of their lives. Zoom out even further and the picture gets bigger still. So far this year, wildfires have already burned through well over 100,000 hectares of land across Spain, and that is on top of a previous year that was already the worst fire season the country had recorded in its recent history. Spain is not dealing with one bad fire. It is dealing with a pattern that keeps repeating and keeps getting worse year after year. Now here's the detail we teased at the start of this video. And it is one of the strangest true facts in this entire crisis. Near the fire zone west of Madrid sits a facility most people have never heard of, called the Madrid Deep Space Communications Complex. This is one of only 3 stations on the entire planet, alongside sites in the United States and Australia, that space agencies use to send and receive signals from spacecraft exploring far beyond Earth, including missions traveling near other planets in our solar system. It is essentially one of humanity's only phone lines to the outer parts of the solar system, and there is no backup sitting right next door if something happens to it. That complex sits close enough to the fire zone that flames swept onto its grounds this week. Stop and really think about that for a second. A wildfire that started because of dry grass and a shifting summer wind ended up threatening a facility that helps scientists talk to spacecraft flying past other worlds, tools that took years to plan and build and cannot simply be replaced overnight if they are damaged. That is the kind of detail that shows you just how unusual and how serious this fire season has become. It is not just touching farms and forests and small towns anymore. It is reaching infrastructure that connects us to space itself. That gives you a picture of what Spain is dealing with. But as intense as this is, what is happening in France right now might be even harder to believe because of just how many people have had to leave their homes there. Section 3, France's peacetime war. Here's a number that is going to make you stop and reread it to make sure you got it right. Across the fires burning in southwestern France, roughly 250,000 people have been ordered to evacuate from the Gironde and Landes regions combined. When you add in the people evacuated in Spain at the same time, the 2 countries together have pushed past 300,000 people forced out of their homes this month alone. That is why officials in France are calling this one of the largest peacetime evacuations the country has ever carried out, with some describing it as the biggest since the Second World War. Peacetime is doing a lot of work in that sentence. France is one of the most visited countries on Earth, home to one of the largest economies in Europe. And this week, it has had to move people out of an entire region the way a country moves people during war. Except the enemy this time is fire instead of an army. Let's talk about where this is actually happening, because the location makes it even more dramatic. The fires are tearing through the Landes forest, which is the largest area of forest anywhere in Western Europe. This forest was actually planted on purpose back in the 1800s to hold down sandy coastline and stop the dunes along the Atlantic from shifting and swallowing farmland. It is made up mostly of a type of pine tree that is, unfortunately, almost perfectly designed to burn. These pines are full of natural resin and oil. They drop a thick layer of dry needles onto the forest floor every year, and they grow packed closely together, which lets fire jump from treetop to treetop incredibly fast. When a fire like this gets going in a forest like that, it does not creep along slowly. It runs, the way flames race up a stack of dry firewood the second a spark lands in it. The fire broke out near a town called Samos and quickly pushed toward a peninsula on the Atlantic coast called Les Cap Ferret, which is one of France's most famous and most visited summer coastal areas. This is important because a lot of the people there were not year-round residents. They were tourists and summer visitors, people who did not necessarily know the local roads, who did not have cars packed and ready to go, who were relaxing on vacation one moment and getting emergency alerts on their phones, telling them to evacuate immediately the next. Authorities eventually ordered the entire Cap Ferret Peninsula emptied out, close to 40,000 people at once, sending them streaming toward Bordeaux along roads that were never designed to carry that many cars in a single afternoon. France's emergency alert system sent messages directly to phones across multiple towns, telling people to head toward Bordeaux right away. Entire neighborhoods emptied out within hours. Shelters in Bordeaux filled up fast with families carrying whatever they managed to grab on their way out the door, some of them with pets and carriers and nothing else. Some residents, who were allowed back briefly to check on their homes, found nothing left standing. The fire had moved through faster than the time it took them to drive to a shelter and drive back. This was not a small, contained blaze either. Before crews finally managed to stabilize it, the fire had scorched an area of more than 400 square kilometers, big enough that officials compared it to roughly 5 times the scale of the last major fire this same region suffered a few years earlier, which had already been considered one of the worst fires France had ever seen. A major highway had to be partly closed, train service south of Bordeaux was suspended in places, and nearly 100 firefighters were injured over the course of the operation. A reminder that behind every evacuation number is a group of exhausted crews putting their own safety on the line hour after hour. One official overseeing the response explained the alert system in plain terms, saying that every single resident in the fire's path, whether they lived there year-round or were only visiting for the week, would get a direct alert on their phone the moment their specific area needed to leave. That is a completely different approach than the old method of announcing evacuations on the news and hoping everyone happened to be watching. It meant a tourist asleep in a rented cottage at 6 in the morning could be woken up by their own phone telling them exactly where the fire was and exactly which direction to drive. France's president ordered the military to help mobilize resources as the fire pushed closer and closer to Bordeaux itself, a major city. Officials warned that if conditions did not improve, the fire had enough fuel and enough open ground ahead of it to keep growing for days. At one point, wind gusts were expected to reach around 80 kilometers an hour, which is more than strong enough to send burning embers flying far ahead of the main fire line and start brand new fires before anyone even sees them coming. Even after the fire was officially called stabilized, meaning crews had stopped it from spreading any further for the moment, authorities were careful to say it was not the same as being fully out, warning that returning heat and dropping humidity could let it break loose again at any point. There was some good news along the way, too. Thousands of evacuated residents in a few of the smaller towns were eventually allowed to return home once crews confirmed those specific areas were safe again, including families in a couple of neighborhoods known for a small aviation community and a large campground. But even as those families were unpacking their bags again, fresh flames broke out near a popular beach on the same peninsula just days later, and authorities had to send planes and helicopters right back into the air, a clear sign that stabilized never meant safe in this crisis. Because the fire kept threatening to break loose again and again, France asked other European countries for direct help through an emergency assistance program that the European Union runs specifically for situations like this. Countries including Croatia, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, the Czech Republic, and Turkey sent firefighting planes and helicopters to reinforce French crews on the ground, on top of hundreds of firefighters from other nations who had already been stationed in high-risk parts of France and Spain earlier in the summer as a precaution, ready to move the moment they were needed. That is 6 or more separate countries choosing to send their own aircraft and personnel into another country's fire purely because the scale of the disaster made it clear no single nation could handle it alone. Now, here's a part of this story that most coverage rushes past, and it deserves way more attention than it gets. This fire is burning close to Bordeaux wine country, one of the most famous and valuable wine-producing regions on the entire planet. The vineyards themselves have not been directly burned, at least not yet, but wine experts have been warning about something called smoke taint. This happens when grapes hanging on the vine absorb smoke from nearby wildfires, and it permanently changes the flavor of any wine made from those grapes afterward. You cannot wash it off. You cannot fix it later in the winemaking process. Once the grapes absorb enough smoke, that entire year's harvest from that vineyard is affected, and there is no way to reverse it once it happens. Think about what that actually means. Some of these vineyards have been growing grapes on the exact same small patches of land for generations, sometimes for more than a century. The soil, the drainage, the way the sun hits those specific slopes, all of that combines to create a wine that cannot be recreated anywhere else on Earth, no matter how much money you spend trying to copy it somewhere else. If smoke damage hits these vineyards hard enough, it is not just a bad year for a farmer. It is a permanent scar on one of the most valuable agricultural traditions in the world, and there is no way to speed up the recovery. You simply wait for next year's grapes and hope the air stays clean enough for them to grow properly, with no guarantee that next summer will be any different. So, in France, you have a fire that forced one of the largest peacetime evacuations in the country's history, threatened a major city, pulled in emergency aid from more than half a dozen other nations, and put decades of wine-growing tradition at risk, all at the same time. That alone would be one of the biggest news stories of the year in a normal summer. But Italy is dealing with something almost as intense, and in some ways it is even stranger, because Italy is fighting 2 completely different disasters in 2 completely different parts of the same country at the exact same time. Section 4. Italy burns from both ends. Let's start in the south, on the island of Sicily, because the numbers here are honestly hard to process. Since the middle of this month alone, Italian firefighters have responded to more than 1,000 separate fire emergencies across the island. 1,000. That is not one massive fire. That is an enormous number of individual outbreaks, all happening close enough together in time that emergency crews barely get a break between calls before the next one comes in. Sicily has had around 6,000 firefighters, forestry workers, and civil protection volunteers deployed at once trying to keep up with this. On a single day this month, authorities logged close to 50 active fires burning across the island out of more than 300 that had been reported that same week. The region's president described one particular day as one of the most difficult the island has faced in decades, which is a heavy thing to say about a place that deals with summer fires almost every year. This crisis has already cost lives. A 59-year-old member of the fire service died from a medical emergency while working to put out a blaze near Caltanissetta, one of Sicily's inland provinces. In just a 48-hour period this month, 3 firefighters lost their lives fighting these fires across the wider crisis, 2 in France and 1 in Sicily. These are not statistics. These are people who ran toward the fire so that other people's homes and lives could be protected, and it cost them everything. Fires have burned through towns across the island, from areas near Agrigento to the hills around Palermo, forcing evacuations that included transferring patients out of a local clinic and moving elderly residents out of care facilities as flames approached populated areas. In one town, a fire whipped up by strong seasonal winds reached the very edge of the community, and firefighters had to protect a cluster of sensitive locations all at once, including an oxygen storage depot, a fuel station, and a fireworks factory, any one of which could have turned a bad fire into a catastrophic explosion if the flames had reached it. In another area, the fires temporarily cut off the drinking water supply to around 20 different municipalities at once, meaning the fire was not just burning land. It was actively taking away people's access to clean water while the emergency was still ongoing. Just off the coast, Sardinia has been dealing with its own separate wave of fires, driven by the same hot, dry winds blowing in from the south. The island has recorded well over 1,000 individual fires so far this year, and regional authorities have kept much of Sardinia under a high danger alert for days in a row, warning that any brand new outbreak could overwhelm ordinary firefighting crews, almost instantly given how dry everything already is. Helicopters and ground teams have had to bounce between multiple towns in a single day, moving from one outbreak straight to the next without much time to rest in between. Zoom out to the whole country, and the scale becomes even clearer. Italy has already burned through more than 36,000 hectares this year, roughly 80% above the 20-year average for the same point in the summer. Sicily, Calabria, and Campania together account for the vast majority of all the land burned nationwide so far. In some of these southern regions, investigators have also raised concerns that a number of fires were started deliberately rather than sparked naturally, which adds a troubling layer to a crisis that is already stretching emergency crews to their limit without needing any extra help getting worse. Here is where Italy's situation becomes genuinely unlike anything happening in Spain or France. While the south of the country is dealing with fire, the north of Italy is dealing with the opposite problem, and it is connected to the exact same underlying cause. The Po River is the longest river in Italy, and it is the main water source for millions of people and for one of the most important farming regions in the entire country. This river just hit its lowest recorded water level ever measured at one of its main monitoring stations, breaking a record that had stood since the drought of 2022. To understand how serious this is, picture a river that is usually deep enough for boats to travel on safely. Right now, the water has dropped so low that old riverbed debris, sunken remains of boats and rocks that are normally hidden underwater, are now exposed and dangerous, making the river basically impossible to navigate safely for anyone. Farmers along the river are running out of water for their crops, forcing many of them to choose which fields to save and which to simply let fail this season. In some areas, salt water from the sea has started pushing back up into the river, in one stretch traveling more than 20 kilometers inland, because there is not enough fresh water flowing down to push against it. That saltwater intrusion poisons farmland in a way that can take years to reverse, sometimes making soil unusable for growing crops for several seasons afterward. What makes this even more alarming is how early it is happening. Experts studying the river have pointed out that the same low water levels being recorded now used to show up much later in the summer, closer to the end of July or into August, back during the historic drought of 2003 that was considered a once-in-a-generation event at the time. This year, those same critically low numbers arrived about a month earlier than that, which tells experts this is not a one-time fluke. It is part of a pattern that keeps repeating in 2022, in the years since, and now again this year, each time arriving a little earlier and hitting a little harder. So in Italy, you have firefighters risking their lives against wildfires in the south, while, at the same moment, farmers in the north watch their main water source shrink to a level nobody alive has ever seen. Two completely different emergencies, hundreds of kilometers apart, both caused by the same brutal combination of extreme heat and almost no rainfall for months on end. It is a little like one half of a country fighting off flames, while the other half quietly runs out of the one thing that could help put them out in the first place. Local officials along the Po have started deploying water tanker trucks to keep some smaller towns supplied while the main river system struggles, a stopgap measure nobody wants to rely on for long, since it treats the symptom without fixing the underlying shortage. Farmers along the river have said openly that this is turning into a serious water crisis for agriculture. Not just an inconvenience, with some crops facing failure this season simply because there was not enough water to go around by the time they needed it most. That brings us to the question everyone watching this should really be asking. Why is this happening in 3 different countries at once? And is it going to keep getting worse? And to understand that, we need to zoom out and look at what is actually driving all of this underneath the surface. Section 5. why this isn't a normal summer anymore. Here's a number that puts this entire crisis into perspective, better than almost anything else. According to the World Health Organization's European office, the total amount of land burned by wildfires across Europe has jumped by 57% in just the last 4 years. In 2022, wildfires burned through about 1.4 million hectares across the region. Last year alone, that number reached 2.2 million hectares. That is not a small shift. That is a massive jump in a very short amount of time. And this year is already on pace to challenge those numbers again, with Spain and Portugal both reporting more than double the number of individual wildfires compared to the same point last year. It is worth pointing out just how much coordinated effort is already going into fighting this before you even get to the numbers above. The European Union keeps a shared reserve of firefighting planes and helicopters ready to move at short notice. And this year, it also had hundreds of firefighters from more than a dozen different countries stationed in high-risk parts of France and Spain before a single fire even broke out, purely so they could reinforce local crews the moment things got bad. That kind of advanced planning is a big part of why the response has been as fast as it has been. But even a system built specifically to handle emergencies like this is now being pushed close to its limit, which tells you something important about how much bigger these fire seasons have become compared to just a few years ago. Health officials have also pointed out that the damage from these fires does not stop the moment the flames go out. Smoke from a wildfire can travel hundreds of kilometers, carrying tiny particles that make it harder to breathe long after the fire itself has moved on, especially for older people, young children, and anyone with an existing heart or lung condition. A fire in one province can end up affecting the health of people living in a completely different city who never saw a single flame. So what is actually causing fires to behave this differently than they used to? It really comes down to a chain reaction, and once you understand each link in that chain, the whole crisis makes a lot more sense. It starts with drought. Southern Europe has been getting drier for years. The dry periods that used to last a few weeks before rain finally broke the cycle are now stretching on for months at a time. When soil and plants dry out that much, the risk of fire does not rise slowly and steadily. It rises in a way that speeds up faster and faster the drier everything gets. Slightly dry grass is harder to light than you might think. Extremely dry grass and brush, the kind sitting across huge parts of Spain, France, and Italy right now, can catch from something as small as a spark off a piece of machinery or a discarded cigarette. And once it catches, it spreads almost instantly because everything around it is just as dry and just as ready to burn, the same way a whole box of dry matches goes up the moment one of them lights. Then you add heat. Southern Europe has been baking under repeated heat waves this summer, with temperatures in parts of Spain climbing past 44 degrees Celsius, which is well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Some parts of the continent have already gone through 3 or 4 separate heat waves in a single summer. Heat like that pulls even more moisture out of plants and soil that are already struggling, making the fire risk even worse on top of the drought that already existed, almost like turning up the oven under something that was already close to catching fire on its own. Finally, you add wind. And this is the part that makes containing these fires so difficult, even with thousands of firefighters and dozens of aircraft working around the clock. Firefighters build fire breaks, which are basically gaps cleared in vegetation designed to stop a fire from spreading further in a certain direction. That strategy works well under normal conditions. But when wind suddenly shifts direction, which has been happening constantly in all 3 countries this summer, a fire break that was protecting one side of a town can suddenly end up behind the fire instead of in front of it. The fire jumps the line. New fronts open up in places nobody expected. Crews have to scramble and reposition everything they had set up, and in the time it takes to do that, more land burns. This is exactly why officials in Madrid, in Bordeaux, and across Sicily keep repeating some version of the same warning. They can throw enormous resources at these fires, and they have, but almost every official statement this week now includes some version of the same sentence. We cannot fully control this until the weather changes. And right now, forecasters are not expecting that change to arrive soon. Scientists studying this pattern have also pointed out that Europe is warming faster than almost anywhere else on the planet, heating up at more than twice the global average rate. That single fact helps explain why a continent that used to deal with wildfires as a summer inconvenience is now dealing with them as a recurring national emergency, year after year, in country after country. Here's the part that matters most for anyone living in or traveling through these regions. The drought conditions that caused this crisis are not going to fully recover before next summer rolls around. Experts warn that Europe is entering a stretch where wildfire seasons last longer, start earlier, and reach areas that were never considered high risk before, including places close to major cities like Madrid and Bordeaux that used to feel relatively protected simply because of their location, tucked away from the traditional hot, dry zones further south. The people affected by these fires did nothing wrong, They did not build in reckless places or ignore safety warnings. They lived in towns that have existed peacefully for centuries, in landscapes that are now being reshaped by conditions almost nobody living there had any control over. Some of these towns have never experienced a fire like this in their entire recorded history, and now they are facing one directly, with no real playbook for what comes after the flames finally die down. If you or anyone you know is in Spain, France, Italy, or anywhere else in Southern Europe right now, the most important thing you can do is simple. Follow the instructions from local emergency authorities the moment they are given, and do not wait around to see how things develop first. In fire situations like this one, conditions can change faster than anyone expects, and the people who evacuated early, the moment they were told to, are the ones who made it out safely with time to spare, while the people who waited to see how bad things would get were often the ones who ended up needing rescue instead. Step back and look at the whole picture one more time. A capital city breathing through wildfire smoke, a wine region waiting to find out if this year's harvest is ruined, an island losing firefighters while a river hundreds of kilometers away hits a record low. None of these three things happened on their own. They are all branches of the exact same underlying problem, showing up in 3 different countries, in 3 completely different ways, within the same few weeks. That is what makes this summer different from the wildfire seasons people remember from years past. It is not one bad fire in one bad location. It is an entire region of the world getting hit from multiple directions at once, and every one of those directions traces back to the same hotter, drier pattern repeating itself more often than it used to. There's also a quieter cost building underneath all of this that rarely makes the headlines. Tourism drives a huge share of the economy across Spain, France, and Italy every single summer, and all 3 of these fires have hit right in the middle of peak travel season in some of the most visited regions on the continent. Hotels sit empty in towns under evacuation orders. Flights get rerouted around closed airspace. Farmers lose entire harvests they were counting on to make it through the rest of the year. None of that shows up in a headline about hectares burned, but it is very real money and very real livelihoods, on top of the immediate danger to people's homes and safety. This is where things stand right now, but this story is far from finished. Fire crews across 3 countries are still working through exhausting shifts, water levels in northern Italy are still dropping, and forecasters are watching closely to see whether the next heat wave makes everything worse before it gets better. If this video helped you actually understand what is happening across Europe right now instead of just scaring you with headlines, tap like and subscribe so you do not miss the next update on this story. And here is a question for you down in the comments. Out of everything in this video, which detail shocked you the most? The army being called in near Madrid, France's largest peacetime evacuation, or a wildfire reaching a facility that talks to spacecraft in outer space?